Alright, guys, so I'm going to be talking about 1984 and the first chapter. This is just my reading and my reaction and the things that I think about and make connections with as I'm going through it. This isn't my first time reading it. It's got to be between maybe the fifth and around there, maybe fifth, sixth time reading it. But every time I come back to it, I'm a different person, so I can kind of make more connections and think about it differently. So here we go. I flipped just out of curiosity to the publisher page. According to my book, it says it was published in 1949 originally. Just something to think about. So one of the keys to reading Orwell would be understanding what an allegory is, but without getting too caught up in it, especially for a lot of you guys if you don't have the maybe historical knowledge that Orwell is explicitly referring to. That's okay, and you can build on that later, but you can still go through the story, read the story for what it is, and understand what he's trying to tell you. And then as you begin to see more of these things in the outside world, you'll be able to put it into his kind of structure that he's created for you. So something I'll do later is I'll go through and show here are all the concepts that Orwell has in 1984, and here's the allegorical relationship, or what they correspond to in the outside world. So when you hear me talk about the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, if you're not familiar with that stuff, it's okay, and you'll get more as we go along. I'm going chronologically, by the way, through the book and through the pages. So this, if you're looking through the book, everything that I'm talking about is coming up in order. All right, so we're going through it. Winston lives in Victory Mansions. I probably shouldn't know this, but right off the bat, I'm thinking satire. If it's called a mansion, it's probably not a mansion. If it's called Victory, it probably sucks. All these images of Soviet, Nazi, Maoist style propaganda posters are coming to my mind when you see Big Brother for the first time, with his mustachioed face. Obviously, the mustache is the key to being a good dictator. The economy drive has the people saving power, so there's no electricity in daylight. And right away, I'm thinking of North Korea, where this is actually happening today, or when I checked, as of 2020, the North Korean city of Pyongyang doesn't have electricity during the daytime, and that's the most elite part of the country, just because they've pigeonholed themselves, because their nation is so scarce of resources, and because most of those resources are diverted to the ruling class. We have Hate Week, which is something I'm going to come back to, but the idea of hate is obviously not foreign to our culture right now. And Big Brother is watching you is the caption beneath the poster. So this is one of the big takeaways for me, is like how much Orwell has pervaded, how Orwell has just become a part of the English language, and some of these ideas are so predictive, and his language has become so embedded in English. For example, Big Brother, meaning that some form of state surveillance. He explained the concepts in the most clean and concise allegories. So everything is this kind of allegorical comparative relationship between real world and his fictional universe. The telescreen is something else that he has this kind of predictive power of. The telescreen could be dimmed but not turned off completely. What does that sound like? Even if you're not asking Siri a question, she is listening to you. So I went and did a little research. It says the TV, or the television, was invented in 1927. So Orwell didn't invent the television, obviously, but the idea is that only after the late 1940s, 1950s did the television become more popularized. After World War II, that's when it started to become a primary way of influencing the public opinion. And so, Orwell is right in that pocket of 1949, but he's already kind of understood or projecting into the future the influence that the telescreen would have. And we'll talk more about the telescreen in a moment. The party has a uniform. That seems pretty standard of dictatorships and regimes. What do uniforms do? They unify people, but they also, erase individuality of people. Ingsoc is mentioned, and we don't know what that is yet, but just the acronymization and abbreviation of language is a prevalent theme here. The helicopter of the police patrol is seen snooping into people's windows, but the patrols did not matter. It wasn't the police that Winston is concerned with. Only the thought police mattered. And so this is the first introduction of another concept that's, embedded in our language, and that's the thought police. And the idea that Winston isn't even afraid of the police, he's afraid of the thought police, shows kind of how the nature of policing or crime has kind of evolved. There's a mention of the 9th 3-year plan. This is obviously a reference to the Soviet Union's 5-year plans under Stalin, for the most part. The fact that it's the 9th 3-year plan, it might be some satire implying that the plans aren't working and that their failures are being ignored and repeated over and over again, which is the definition of insanity, right? At least that's what I take from it. Basically, the idea of 5-year plans were sort of economic quotas that the government would set forth, saying, hey, we're going to have this many of X item in 5 years. Inevitably, after things like dekulakization and just the imprisonment of productive people would lead to these plans not being met. And in the Soviet Union, at least, it was referred to as wrecking, which meant that there were evil capitalists that had infiltrated the system, and that's the only reason why the plans were failing, was because the West was sabotaging them. That's largely not true. The telescreen, back to that, here's some more predictive power of Orwell. The telescreen receives and transmits simultaneously and can see and hear above a whisper. Well, to me that sounds like the internet. It receives and transmits simultaneously. That is Wi-Fi. And again, it can see and hear above a whisper. That is, the WikiLeaks documents telling us that we are being watched. Not necessarily at every moment, literally, and can predict our behavior better than we can. All the way up to actually, the NSA being able to command your screen. So let's continue. Orwell predicts internet, and maybe this is kind of a webcam too, right? Because the webcam is, it's a TV like, or maybe I want to say a computer like the one I'm recording into now. It has a webcam built into it, so it's also capturing that. There's even a mention to maybe some, data storage, which is something that would be crazy to think about in 1949, but he says it was possible they watched everybody all the time, right? So there's this conspiracy or this attitude of, how do you know who the thought police is watching? Whose telescreen are they tuned into? And Winston says, well, they can tune into any telescreen at any time, but for all we know, they're watching all telescreens all the time. And so likely there wouldn't be the manpower to do that, but it could be something like collecting data and running it through, algorithms, etc., to search for keywords that might be deemed, thought-provoking, God forbid. Let's continue here. I think we're still within the first couple pages. So Winston works for the Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True, as it's referred to in Newspeak. Newspeak is, and again, something else that's penetrated our language, and it's such a clear and concise idea that it's really powerful. So this is when you start to understand what Newspeak or doublespeak really is. For example, if we skip ahead just a bit to his definitions of the ministries, the four ministries that make up the government are Mini-True, or the Ministry of Truth. And of course, what are they in charge of? News, entertainment, education, and fine arts. So there's an implication there that truth is a synonym for indoctrination. And so you have these dueling, diametrically opposed ideas, where that makes up the crux of doublespeak. And I'll do a little thinking about that and talk more about doublespeak later. The Ministry of Peace, this is probably the most clear one, right? The Ministry of Peace, what do? They are leading wars, right? So peace and war, obviously opposite ideas, and every time they say peace, they mean war. So this is a key concept of doublespeak. I just realized I skipped over the Ministry of Love, so why don't I hit that really quick? Mini-Love, or Ministry of Love, maintained law and order. So this is the police arm of the state. It's classic how the Ministry of Love, and obviously satire is meant to be funny, guys, so when you see things that don't make sense, Orwell is often ridiculing them. And remember, satire usually ridicules like an institution, not always, maybe a person, but that could be closer to parody. So the Ministry of Love has no windows. It's only possible to enter on official business. And then this is a quote, then by penetrating a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests, guarded all around by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed truncheons. And so, yeah, this is one, it's satirical because the Ministry of Love, shouldn't there be like no borders, and it should be all open and say, everybody come in, you don't need to have an appointment, right? Just get in here, we love you. Not only is it funny because of that, I also see some sexual innuendo going on here. It is the Ministry of Love. You might say, Medina, why is your head in the gutter? Get your head out of the gutter. But, after you've read a certain amount of Shakespeare, you see this, you pick up on these things. And so the word penetrating is what I'm cued in on here. I mean, we know that diction, right, is the author's use of language, and it's intentional. And so think about, in terms of a sexual innuendo, how this might relate to, comparing the Ministry of Love to a woman or something like that. By penetrating a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests, and it's guarded by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed truncheons. And, between the penetrating the maze and the jointed truncheons, which seems like a phallic symbol to me, I think Orwell is making two kind of jokes here, the satire of the Ministry of Love, but also the comparison of the state of the Ministry of Love or the appearance of the Ministry of Love to sort of like men trying to court a woman or something like that. Let me know what you think. There's the Ministry of Plenty, which is responsible for economic affairs and, again, recalling Soviet history. That's obviously funny because the Ministry of Plenty is running a country that has scarcity in almost everything, right? They don't even have enough boots to give their soldiers, etc. Just look at, again, North Korea would be a great example of that. There's some references to the place, the setting, Oceania. Could be pronouncing that wrong. Haven't really researched that. Sorry about that. But there's references to these kind of three main places, Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia, I believe. And so it's the one thing I'll say that you could infer right off the bat is that why are there only three places, right? They're not referred to as continents, but they kind of have the size, the grandeur of a continent, like Oceania. That sounds like a hefty chunk of state, and so it seems like maybe the amount of countries might have gone down, right? Maybe there's like sort of a monopolization, just like how there would be in a market economy. Well, there's Google, right, and that's pretty much it, or Facebook. So it seems like the same kind of thing has happened with political boundaries, where maybe dictatorships have gathered these massive areas to where there are really only three um, localities. Okay. Winston continues and he starts to recount the poor state of London. So they are in London in Oceania. Um, and, when I'm reading this, these images of London connect to me to Orwell's other works, such as Road to Wigan Pier. Orwell, if you don't know, as a socialist, he actually goes out in some of his works, like Road to Wigan Pier, goes out into working class areas, lower class areas, and lives with family members, interviews people about how they survive. What does their budget look like? And he describes a lot of the poor economic state of London there. It even reminds me, going all the way back to William Blake and like his poem of London, and that was in the 1800s, or like right at the 1800 mark, I think, like 1794. And so, that critique of London is still standing in 1949, which there's something to say for critique of capitalism there, and the critique of the industrial revolution or complex that we're in now. We'll talk about that more later. All right, the Newspeak is the official language of Oceania, and the three slogans of the party. Again, this is Newspeak in a nutshell right here. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And so if you think about what does the word is mean, right? Is in the English language is it's an equal sign. Okay, so if you're doing math, 2 equals 2, right? That is a true statement. It is true. And so what they've done here is take an equal sign and put it between war and peace. War equals peace. And so if you're a thinking person who knows the definition of war in the dictionary and peace in the dictionary, you know that's not true. So one of the questions Orwell is bringing up already is, what are the mental gymnastics you have to do to see a statement like war equals peace and nod along and say, yes, war is peace. War equals peace. What has to happen in your psychology, in your mind, in your life for you to believe that that is true? To believe that freedom is slavery. Yep, check. Ignorance is strength, right? What has to happen? So that's a huge arc of this book. So Winston has set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. So there's this kind of idea that you're suppressing who you actually are inside, because you never know who's watching you, who's listening to you, or what emotion you're going to wear that will betray you. And to me, again, this brings me back to North Korea. I've shown in the past to my classes the videos of the North Korean cheerleaders at the Olympic Games. If you haven't seen that, go on YouTube, Google North Korean cheerleaders, and you'll see that there's one man present. He's sitting there, he's not cheering, and all my classes have inferred that he is basically the equivalent of the telescreen there, making sure that these girls are enthusiastic, that they are cheering as vociferously as they can. And, unfortunately, there may be the reversed incentive of, okay, he who cheers the quietest is not coming back, if you get my drift. And you see the parallels to this in the Soviet Union with the applause of Stalin, even in the Ba'athist courts with Saddam Hussein. To continue on, black bread and victory gin. So there is a reference to food called black bread or dark hunk of bread, and it's alcohol called victory gin. These are obviously parallels to the Soviet Russia's famine and vodkaholics. It's in London though, so they have to have gin, of course. The black bread is one of those rare foods that they had enough to go around, I guess, but not even really enough to go around. If you read like the Gulag Archipelago, you'll see references to black bread in the prison and labor camps, and that was pretty much all they would get in terms of food. maybe like a little soup, which was basically just hot water with whatever like scraps and bones and stuff they could throw in it. Then there's a reference to Victory cigarettes. So by now we have Victory gin, Victory cigarettes, Victory mansions. So I'm inferring, okay, either everything is a brand marked Victory, so either there's only one brand, like a monopolistic kind of capitalist thing, or more likely that brand is the government's brand, right? It's the state controlled means of production, which is communism in a nutshell. And so that's where my head is leaning, rather than sort of a market monopoly. Winston has an alcove where he can hide from his telescreen, and that's where he's going to try and begin writing. He buys, sorry, I got a text. He buys a book, a little journal, at a free market shop. They're not strictly ruled against because it's the only place for items like shoelaces. So this is just more satire. I mean, he's saying that in sentences before, well, the state controls the means of production, right? They make cigarettes, they make gin, but they aren't good enough at controlling the means of production to where they can produce everything. There are some things that they have failed to produce, like shoelaces, right? Imagine a society with shoes and no shoelaces. So there are these free market, or maybe you want to call them black market shops, where you can still go in and buy things like you would in a capitalist society or a market society. Last thing on page 6 here, there's a reference to the 25-year sentence in a hard labor camp. Again, this is a reference to something that would be called the quarter in the Soviet Union. The quarter was slang term for a 25-year sentence. So there were nickels, there were quarters. A quarter was a standard sentence, although it was along the highest level of sentences other than life. So usually 25 years was the most amount of years that you would be sentenced to under something like Article 58, which you can look up. I highly recommend if you haven't read the Gulag Archipelago. However, even though it was like a high sentence, many people were given it, and these were reserved usually for the political crimes, such as just disagreeing with the government, etc. And we can go more into Article 58 later. So that's page 1 through 6, guys, and I still have 13 more pages to go. So Orwell brings up speak right, and this kind of sounds like some technology like voice recognition, something that would type out your text, or you would dictate into it and it would make a manuscript. Otherwise, it's basically like a vlog or something like I'm doing to you. So all these little interesting technological foresights that he has. I think technology is underrated in the way that it's influencing these kind of movements in our society where it is today. He makes a mention to the proles, so we'll talk about a little bit of Marxism that you need to know to understand 1984. Basically, the idea is that the way Marx sees it, there is a elite class, the bourgeoisie, and there is an underclass called the proletariat. Proles would be short for proletariat. It's kind of reminiscent of plebes, which is like an underclass. And so we'll discuss more of that later, but there's a lot of content out there explaining the basics of Marxism. Basically, oppressed, the proletariat versus the oppressors, bourgeoisie. He notices this girl and has some pretty interesting thoughts about her. The girl works in the fiction department, and she's a member of the Junior Anti-Sex League. And so here, this is reminiscent of Animal Farm too, where you have the puppies that are taken at birth and sent to a separate school away from everybody else. There's just with that word junior, they're kind of implying that there's some sort of indoctrination of the youth that's taking place, where young people are put into these programs to learn concepts like anti-sex, being against sex. And obviously, if you're a human being, it's hard to be against sex and continue our species, right? It's one thing to be responsible, it's another thing to be anti-sex. Being anti-sex is basically anti-human. And she works in the fiction department. I'm sure there's some sort of irony there that we don't know about yet. Winston continues that the young, pretty women were the most dangerous, bigoted adherents of orthodoxy. I'll just let that one sit. And O'Brien is a high-ranking party official. Winston is really surprised to see him. He's seen him once a year for a dozen years. But there's something about O'Brien that is noteworthy, which is that, you guys hear the parrots? Sorry, those are Long Beach parrots. Something about O'Brien that he can see in his face is that maybe his political orthodoxy wasn't perfect, right? Winston says he seemed like somebody you could talk to if you could avoid the telescreen. So somehow Winston has this intuition that O'Brien doesn't fully believe everything that he has to espouse as a high-ranking party official. I think the allegory to today and, your representation on social media seems pretty apparent there, that, there are things that you have to put out into the world in order to be accepted, and things that you need to keep a secret unless you want to have some wrath upon you. Now we experience one of the more interesting parts of the chapter, which is the 2 minutes of hate. And so we're getting back to the concept of hate and what that does in an ideological system. Emmanuel Goldstein, enemy of the people, was flashed on a screen. And so he's obviously Jewish, and there's some sort of reference to the Nazi Jewish scapegoating here, and the destructive power of that racial hate. But Goldstein had been a high-ranking official in the party, and he became a counter-revolutionary and escaped death. And so for those two reasons, he's the ultimate scapegoat. He's Jewish, which has historically been a scapegoated people, and kind of a canary in a coal mine in that respect. And also, he's the blame for all the party's impurities. And so there's this relationship or allegory here, too, between 1984 and the Soviet Union. In 1984, anything that happens that's wrong with their oceanic society is Goldstein's fault, right? So, hey, the state couldn't produce shoelaces this year. It's because Emmanuel Goldstein, right, and his counter-revolutionaries are wrecking, or they're sabotaging us. In the Soviet Union, it was the West, right? Hey, we couldn't produce shoes, even though we have all the means of production and all the capital. We failed to produce boots for our soldiers. And whose fault is it? It's the West, right? So there's always a scapegoat, so the party can avoid responsibility. Goldstein, get this, advocates for basically the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. He's out there talking about freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought, which isn't in the First Amendment of the Constitution, but is very closely linked with speech, right? Because what do you have to do before you say something? Well, hopefully you're thinking before you speak, but even if you're not, you're speaking, and that's a reflection of something that you think. So one of the main ideas about Orwell is that everything he's writing is so intensely allegorical. And what I mean by that is usually everything that's being written has this sort of relationship to the outside world. So just know that. And if you're not picking up on every detail, it's fine. And, we'll talk more about that, and you'll learn more about that as we go along. But just kind of understand and appreciate, this is one of the things that Orwell is so prolific and successful at, and why he's become such a highly regarded political satirist. And so with the mention of the sort of basically First Amendment, right, the idea of freedom of speech, thought, press, assembly, we're going to get more into what is it about that idea that is powerful. You can critique it. We'll talk about where are the weaknesses, where are the gaps in that kind of idea, but we'll also try and talk about how that one idea has become so pivotal in our culture today, and how it was such a ballast for our entire country to grow off of. By our country, I mean United States. As the 2 minutes of hate is continuing, Goldstein's speaking on screen, talking about this kind of First Amendment philosophy. He's using rapid polysyllabic speech, and it kind of has this vibe of being too educated for the public to understand. And so this brings me to one of my favorite movies, one of the movies that I think is most representative, unfortunately, of our society and kind of where we're at. Um, Idiocracy, if you haven't seen it. It's a little cringy at times, but I think it really does a good job of satirizing our culture. And in Idiocracy, if you haven't seen it, minor spoiler, Luke Wilson gets sent forward in time, and only to realize, even as an average guy that he was, in the future, he's now the smartest man on earth because he speaks English as I'm speaking to you now. And what's happened is the language has been condensed and basically dumbed down, reduced as not only a tool of, kind of suppression, but basically it's revert to the lowest common denominator. And so what you have with Newspeak is the same kind of concept that Orwell has condensed these words, right? Many true, many love, Newspeak. So there are fewer words in the language. There are smaller, less precise words in the language so that you can't express yourself as clearly. You can't make complex ideas. You can't really communicate in a higher level way with people. And so the idea here is that language can be a tool of suppression, but it can also be a tool of, liberation. And if you're able to understand ideas, communicate them to other people, work through them and break them down, you're ultimately using your freedom of thought to resist, oppressive forces. And so the people in Oceania don't have that luxury. And so when they hear Goldstein talking using polysyllabic speech, oh my God, I can speak, polysyllabic speech, basically meaning long words, right? They can't understand. They don't know what he's saying. And all he's sitting up there talking about is freedom of speech, right? So there's a lot of parallels there to movies like Idiocracy. Demonization of the other. The Eurasian military is seen as a faceless horde, right? And that's something that a lot of dictatorships utilize, is demonization of the outside world. Here Winston references the underground organization called the Brotherhood, which is led by Goldstein to overthrow the state, and they're always getting new recruits. And we learn that the book is Goldstein's unnamed manifesto. And we'll come back to that later, but the main thing I wanted to point out is that usually ideologies have these fundamental texts, right? They have beliefs that are, if not come straight out of ideas, they come out of actual written words. Take religious texts, for examples, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah. A lot of ideologies have this fundamental text. Things like science, have fundamental text by Isaac Newton. I'm not smart enough to remember that off the top of my head, but fundamental texts often undergird or hold up an ideology. And so we're going to look at a lot of what I would consider to be fundamental texts in our class. In the 2 minutes of hate, continuing, we have the screaming and bleating, which bleating is a word that's reserved for sheep, so nice diction there. Shouting in order to drown out Goldstein's 2 minutes of hate. And this has, alarming parallels to where we're at in society right now. Rather than listening, understanding, addressing, breaking down, critiquing other people's ideas in a rational way, we shout in order to drown them out so that we don't have to hear it, so that we don't have to engage. Unfortunately, I saw a lot of this in my career as a college student. I hope that by the time you guys are getting out there, that you're going to be the generation that kind of steers us back into, let's understand and break somebody down using logic. Let's make their point look bad with a better point, rather than being afraid to engage. Continuing on, you are obliged to act a part in the 2 minutes of hate, right? So you have to participate in the hate of Goldstein because you're being watched. But also, Winston makes a good observation that he can't help but join in. So there's this kind of playing on human psychology where, yeah, there's a political fear that you don't want to be, seen as an outsider and sent to a hard labor camp. There's definitely that. But there's also the idea that in human social interactions, there are kind of these innate forces, right? And so, kind of like a mob, Winston can't help but be swept up in the emotion that's around him. Even though he understands that he doesn't even believe it, he can't help but get swept up in it. And this continues into an interesting part here where Winston kind of reveals his sort of, I'm calling it animal sexual instincts. Animals, right? And that we do, as much as you want to argue that we may be socially constructed beings, we do have innate animal instincts that linger. And I think here Winston is channeling these, talking about the girl that he saw, and he's sort of outraged by the girl's aggressive chastity. And this is a really deep section and deep idea. I'm not sure we can go into it here, but I'm really curious to see what you all think about this particular section where Winston is, imagining, killing this girl and also, having intercourse with her, but in a sort of aggressive way. And also he hates her because of her aggressive chastity. There's a whole lot going on there. Let's just continue. The chant is BB, right? Big Brother. And Winston recognizes it as a kind of self-hypnosis. It's a drowning out of your consciousness. And so here I'm thinking, what would you all do if you were in Winston's shoes and you disagreed with the 2 Minutes of Hate or Big Brother, right? I think this is something we can see in our culture. What would you do if you're surrounded by people in this hate mob, right? And they're shouting and chanting, and that if you don't participate, you're going to be called out or potentially punished in your social life, in your private life, whatever. How would you act? Winston meets O'Brien's eyes. So in the 2 Minutes of Hate, he looks over, he sees O'Brien. Just for a moment, O'Brien looks back at him, and Winston has this revelation that he believes O'Brien's on the same page as him, right? Oh, breakfast is ready. That neither of them truly buy into the party's message, and they're keeping up appearances. And that one look is a betrayal if anybody sees it, but it's also a connection, like, oh my gosh, I've made one connection in this dystopian society. And he knows he can't follow up on it. He can't talk to him about it, but at least it gives Winston the idea, like, okay, I'm not crazy. There are other people out there like me. So then the chapter wraps up by Winston taking his journal, trying to begin to write. He first starts writing, propaganda, but in the end, he criticizes by writing down with Big Brother over and over again. So without even consciously realizing it, he's writing down with Big Brother. And the irony here is that he's saying that isn't even the bad part. Writing down with Big Brother isn't even the worst crime. The crime is starting the journal itself, right? Writing his thoughts. He had committed the essential terrible act, thought crime. And that's something we're going to really get into a lot with this book. It seems here so far that the basic idea is that to think is a crime. And so we'll get more into the details of that later. One last reference to Soviet politics here. He hears a knocking on the door and he's like, already? I'm going to get arrested? Because he knows that arrests are always made at night and there's never a trial. There's no record of the arrest. The records are destroyed. You are vaporized. And we're all supposed to pretend like you never existed. And if somebody does ask, hey, where'd Winston go? They're gone too. And so this is a direct reference to what did happen in the Soviet Union, especially under Article 58. But people were encouraged to rat on their neighbors, and usually it wasn't that they were doing anything wrong. It was that, hey, if I get out in front of this, if I rat, then I'll be showing that I'm good, right? And we see a lot of this kind of signaling in our culture today, where it's, if I can blame somebody else first before somebody blames me, then that will make me look better in the eyes of other people. I'm on the right side. Don't come after me. And so the reason why there's no trials and no arrest records is that if you committed a crime, then that would necessitate that there is a flaw in the system, right? But in the utopian system, there can't be anything wrong with the state, right? The state is perfect. So therefore, crime can't exist. And so even if a crime is committed, right, even if somebody does kill somebody, well, oh my gosh, if somebody kills someone, then that would mean that there's a problem with society. But that can't be true. So they sweep the records, make it appear as you never existed. That way they can keep the number on the page, right? Crimes committed, 0. We are a crime-free society because we are a perfect utopia, even though that obviously wasn't real. All right, guys, so we made it to chapter 2. A lot of stream of consciousness here. Me just going through my initial reactions to everything that I read. I know that I'm doing a lot of recognition of the allegory and stuff, but as I said before, you don't have to know any of the outside ideas that I'm talking about. It's just a good reading strategy to always be thinking, especially when you're reading Orwell, be thinking about how can you connect what you're reading to what you're experiencing in your own life, and what you've read, what you've seen on TV, right? Movies you've watched, anything like that. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I look forward to reading chapter 2 with you. Chapter 2 will be shorter. Most of the work here is in chapter 1. Just a lot of concepts came up for the first time that I wanted to lay out and kind of put a star next to, like, hey, notice this. But hopefully I will strive to make shorter videos on the next chapter.